Okay, why do we die?
Our body stops, our cells stop doing things.
Okay. The cells just kind of stop. Other answers? Why do we age? Why don't you just stay looking the way you look right now for the next 60 years? Yeah. Sin. That's why we die, right? Because when Adam and Eve sinned, that brought death and suffering into the world. And we're going to see one of those effects of death and suffering today. So, you would be dead right now if not for the fact that you have an information maintenance system hard at work, listen up folks, inside your body. Remember, your DNA is your body's instruction manual. It tells your body not just how to look, but also how to function and operate. But DNA is also very unstable. That DNA molecule can come apart. It can unzip itself. It can have split ends, if you want to think of it like a hair analogy. But remember those really complicated software systems that were going on inside cells that we looked at in the last chapter? There are programs like that going on inside your body to maintain your genetic code. That's why you're sitting here right now and haven't passed away already. If that wasn't already in place, you would be long gone, and so would I. Your body does not work, and the simplest cell does not work without a near-perfect information maintenance system. A system that repairs DNA when it starts to fray and it starts to break up and gets unstable. Even so, we pick up, every single time a cell divides, 1 to 3 new mutations. Remember that mutations are basically copy errors in your genetic code. Your cells have to multiply, they have to replicate themselves, they have to divide because they have finite lifespans. They don't last forever. Yes? From yesterday, you were supposed to write down these 3 lines. The top one, and then I think this bottom bullet point here. But that was all. Nothing new from today. This would all be good to write down, though. Anyway, so it's been said that, every 7 years you're actually a brand new person because most of the cells in your body die within 7 years and have replicated themselves so that right now, in terms of a cellular level, you're completely different than you were 7 years ago, both inside your body and outside your body. But there's a bad part of this. What happens if, we talk about DNA as an instruction manual. Let's pretend you have this little instruction manual and you make a copy of it. And then you take that copy and you make a copy. And you take that copy and you make a copy. And you take that copy and you make another copy. What's going to happen to that manual? It's going to get worn out. It's going to get awfully hard to read after a while. Maybe after a few copies, there's a couple letters that you can't read. Maybe after 100 copies, there's a few words you can't read. Maybe after 1,000, you can't read a full sentence. Eventually, it gets to a point where you can't follow those instructions anymore. They're unintelligible. Well, the same thing is happening inside your body and in my body and in the body of everything that's alive. As our cells replicate, these mutations, these copy errors build up to a point where things start going wrong. This is why, if you look at your skin right now and you compare it to the skin of my kids who are just in here, one is 1 year old, one is 3, their skin is so much smoother and a lot, just better looking and better feeling. Because over time, your skin cells replicate and they build up these copy errors and your skin doesn't behave or function the way it was originally intended. By the time you are 60 years old, your average skin cell has 40,000 mutations, 40,000 copy errors in it. This is why when you get older, your skin gets all wrinkly and crinkly, because those errors in the genetic code of your skin build up and it doesn't work or function the way it was originally intended. Yes?
So there's no way to fix it, man can fix it?
No, there's no way to fix it. And that's what makes this so sobering, because this is the reason we die, folks. Obviously, it was brought about by sin. But the reason that we have a finite lifespan and can't live beyond 120 years, usually is the max, is because of this mutational process. It's not just your skin that builds up these mutations, it's every other part of your body too. Your heart, your lungs, your liver, your brain. Eventually you get old enough and these mutations accumulate enough that you start having issues with your vital organs. So if somebody gets old enough and they eventually die due to heart failure or something going on in their brain, it's because those mutations have built up to a point over that period of time where their brain can't work the way it's supposed to, or their heart can't work the way it's supposed to. You don't have these issues now because you haven't been alive long enough for your cells to mutate that much and for there to be as many copy errors in there. But as time goes on and those mutations build up, things are going to start going wrong with your body. And eventually we all succumb to that. It doesn't matter how good of health you're in, but health is still good. It's good to be in good health. So again, this is not something that you can overcome. Now, well, I'll get to the rest of this in a second here, but as kind of a bummer of a way to begin class as this is, the problem gets worse still. Because it's not just your vital organs and your skin and other parts of your body that are building up these mutations. They build up in your reproductive organs too. You pass a certain number of mutations onto your kids. So they automatically begin with between 60 and 100 more genetic copy errors than you started life off with. Yes?
So say it's like a 60-year-old had kid, like, then like, certain mutation.
Exactly. So as the older you get, the more mutations are in your reproductive organs, the more mutations you're going to pass on to your kids. And this is a huge problem because, of course, what does evolution say? Evolution says that as time goes on, humanity has been evolving, and all these other animals and creatures have been evolving, getting better and better and better, going up. But what do we see when we look at the actual evidence? We see that you pass these mutations onto your kids, and every subsequent generation is actually worse off than the previous one. Now, of course, the big question here is then how is it that life expectancy has been going up so much, especially in the last century? And the answer to that is simply medical science has outpaced this degeneration right here for the last probably 80 years or so. Since the 1940s, life expectancy has gone up every single year until we got to 2014. Then it went down a little bit. And 2015 went down a little bit more. And 2016 when it went down a little bit more. And 2017 when it went down a little bit more. And 2018 when it went down a little bit more. So at the very least, we're starting to see a leveling off of this. You can only make yourself live for so long. Eventually, this is going to catch up with us, and we're not going to see this exponential growth in life expectancy anymore. And we're seeing signs of that right now. From this next slide, I'm going to come back to this thing with Noah's kids. Go ahead and write this down, please. Yep. So I know this is probably a new word for you. Anybody know what the word deleterious means? I don't blame you. It's science-y speak for slightly bad. So these mutations are not catastrophic. Just because you pass between 60 and 100 mutations to your kids does not mean that they're not going to be well enough off to be born and to live and thrive. Those mutations are only slightly bad. They're not bad enough to be selected out of the population through natural selection, which is a process we'll talk about more in the next section. So the end result of this is the other thing you got to write down. Write all this down too. So what's all this mean? It means evolution is actually running backward, unable to prevent the slow deterioration of the information necessary for life. Remember, DNA is your instruction manual. Not only codes for how you look, but how your body functions. And if it breaks down over time, that's not good. Information could not have arisen by itself, and species cannot survive for millions of years. The human genome is not something that has been improving over the years. It is deteriorating. It is rusting out like a car. And I hate to put it that way. It sounds really negative, but that's exactly what we find here, and that's exactly what we should expect in a fallen world. Ever since the fall, everything has been in a state of decay, including the human genome and the genomes of every other animal. These mutations build up in the offspring of these creatures, and eventually you would get to a point that they can't reproduce anymore. So there's no way humanity could have been around here for millions of years. We supposedly branched off from monkeys like 5 million years ago. There's no way, with the mutational accumulation rate that we see right now, that we could still be here if we've been doing this for millions of years. The mutations would have built up to a point that we would have long since been extinct by now. So far from genetics and DNA pointing to things getting better and better and better through a process of evolution, things are getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And that's exactly what we should expect if we look through the lens of the Bible and its version of history. I'm going to go back a little bit here. So just a quick note on these numbers. So 1 to 3 mutations, 1 to 3 copy errors is what you pick up every time a cell divides. 1 is a very conservative estimate. 3 is a more realistic number. And down here, 60 to 100. Again, 60 is a conservative estimate. 100 is a more realistic number, the number of mutations you pass on to your kids. And speaking of kids, what about Noah's kids? Who can remind me how old Noah and most likely his wife were when they had kids? 500, exactly. So if he was around living for 500 years, sure, then that gives his reproductive organs 500 years to accumulate mutations before he started having kids, and therefore they got a lot larger load than if he had had kids earlier. So that's probably, genetically speaking, why we have such shorter lifespans after Noah and his family. They decrease exponentially over time, like a population decay curve. And that's probably the process that God used in order for that to occur. Now, if you're more curious on how this might have happened in terms of the specifics of it, the research that I've looked at point to these mutations being somewhere in your thyroid hormone. In addition to that, anybody know what a telomere is? Heard of that in biology class? So telomeres are things that tell your cells to reproduce themselves. And your body has telomeres that are only a certain length. Now, when a cell reproduces, those telomeres get a little bit shorter and a little bit shorter. And when you get to the end of it, your cells stop reproducing. So even if the accumulation of these mutations don't kill you, eventually when your telomeres get short enough and your cells don't reproduce anymore, then that's going to be a hard cutoff for your life expectancy. So probably what happened is there was a mutation that affected the thyroid hormone and telomere length. And those two things together probably contributed to this. But of course, this is something God had in mind. He says very specifically before the flood came that he will not, my spirit will not contend with man forever, I believe he says. Man's years will now be 120 years. And so it was by God's declaration, but he probably used this sort of a process to see it through. All right, continuing on from here. We're not going to talk too much about this. Junk DNA is something that students used to be taught, not so much anymore. There was a big issue with how we could have had so many good mutations since the time that we branched off from monkeys. Nobody saw how that could be a realistic thing, because in those millions of years, at the rates we currently see, we'd only have about 100 or so. So there was this big thing that they were trying to patch it up with, kind of like you patch up the theory of the Big Bang with dark matter and dark energy. And it ended up not working for them. If you've ever heard the idea that your DNA is only like 80 or 90%, that you're not using 80 or 90% of your DNA, that's completely false, in the same way that you use a lot more than 10% of your brain. You use 100% of your brain. But they had to think that in order for their version of history to have a plausible shot at being true. So we're just going to pass through this here. And this is where things get kind of fun. So when we look at the Bible, what does the Bible tell us? It tells us that Adam and Eve were created about 6,000 years ago. The population grew. There was a bottleneck. What caused that bottleneck? Noah's flood, absolutely, which came about as a result of sin. So you're not wrong. And then there was a single dispersal from a central point in the Middle East, and of course that's where the Tower of Babel would have been located. So the scientific community has their own version of history. Let's see how similar or dissimilar they are. First humans evolved onto the scene 250,000 years ago. The population grew, there was a population bottleneck, and there was a single dispersal from a central point in northeast Africa, a couple hundred miles away from the Middle East. Sound a little familiar? It's kind of interesting how when you let the data speak for itself, it starts to really reflect the biblical version of history. So I'll just kind of go back and forth here. You can sort of see how much of this remains the same. The main thing that changes is the timeline. So let's just kind of go through their timeline here. First humans came on the scene. That happens in both stories. Population grew. That's in both stories. Population bottleneck. wonder why the scientific community thinks that there was a bottleneck. After all, they're doing their best to get away from the biblical version of history and trying to say that the Bible's untrue. The reason that they have to include a bottleneck here is because when we look at humanity, again, we supposedly branched off from our ape cousins about 5 million years ago. In that period of time, humanity supposedly filled the earth, and you had people in the Americas and in Australia and in Europe and all the other continents. And they should have been separate from each other over those 5 million years of time. Well, if that's true, then there should be all sorts of differences when you look at the genetic code of different people groups. But guess what? We don't see these differences. Humanity is remarkably similar, regardless of what continent you look on. Way too similar for these 5 million years of history to be a true story. So the question is, in their minds, how do we patch up this issue? The only way that you can get rid of genetic diversity that they say ought to be there is by killing everybody. And so that's what they say happened. That there was this population bottleneck. 70,000 years ago, only a couple people survived. And from that small group, we have the population of Earth today. And that's why we're so similar, as opposed to the Earth just not being around that long. Again, you can easily see the patchwork that they're laying here. So this is just kind of what I said. Noah's flood is part of our history in the Bible. The evolutionary worldview says humans have been around for millions of years, but our small amount of genetic diversity doesn't jibe with that. So there must have been a catastrophe that killed almost anyone. It's the only way that you can get rid of that diversity. A couple other interesting points to touch on here. So when you look at genetics and DNA, you can trace back a lot of human history. I mean, after all, these are the days when you can spit in a cup, send it off to a company, and they can tell you your heritage. They can tell you exactly what percentage you are from different places across the world. And you can use that in order to map out human history in a lot of ways. And when we look at the mutation rates, the accumulation of these genetic mistakes in mitochondrial DNA, because mitochondrial DNA is passed on through women, using the mutation rates we see today, if you extrapolate that back into the past at our current rates, you would end up with a perfect non-mutant genetic woman from 6,000 years ago. Of course, that would be Eve. But the story of evolution has a different idea. They say that assuming humans evolved from chimps, and assuming a low mutation rate, a mutation rate much less than what we see in the world today, then they call her mitochondrial Eve, existed 150,000 years ago. You can do the same thing with men. Men have Y chromosomes, women do not. If you use real-world mutation rates in these Y chromosomes that we see today, and you go back at that mutation rate, 6,000 years ago, you'd end with one person with no mutations, and that would be Adam. The story of evolution says that assuming humans evolved from chimps and a high mutation rate, assuming a higher mutation rate than what we see in the real world today, our Y chromosome Adam, they call him, they don't think of him as the biblical Adam, existed 250,000 years ago. So once again, folks, when you look at evolution, they have to patch up these inconsistencies. For Y chromosome Adam, they call him, you have to assume a much higher than the current mutation rate. For mitochondrial Eve, you have to assume a much lower mutation rate. So not only do they have to throw these fudge factors in, these fudge factors are opposed to each other, right? For Adam, they had to assume a higher than normal, and for mitochondrial Eve, they had to assume a much slower than normal. But with the biblical version of history, everything matches up just fine. Again, when you look at the data and you step back, it always points.
Please pardon the interruption. Brooklyn Hoffman and Jelana Smith-Rainey, please come to the office. Brooklyn Hoffman and Jelana Smith-Rainey to the office.
When you step back and look at all this information, it always points unequivocally to the history laid out in the Bible. And that's one of the reasons I love teaching this class so much, and we're going to be seeing so much more of this as we go forward. But we're not done today. The dispersion. This is really cool. How many women were on the ark?
Oh, wait, no. There was Noah, his sons, and wasn't it his son's sons?
Nope. Yeah, and how many sons did he have?
Two.
Three. So 4 women total. Now, after the flood, the Bible doesn't say anything about Noah and his wife having any more kids. So we can assume, though, that his kids had kids because the Bible tells us so. So we would expect 3 female lineages on earth today, and we would expect 1 male lineage because all of Noah's sons came from Noah and his family. That's just 1 lineage. Well, guess what we find when we look at evolution? They admit there are 3 female lineages in this world today and 1 male lineage in this world today. Isn't it funny how when you look at the real data and let it speak for itself, it always points back to the biblical version of history? Even though I kind of feel bad for the scientific community because they so much want to get away from what's going on in the Bible and they want to pretend that it's all make-believe. But again, when we look at all of this data, which is just data, and you just use common sense interpretation behind it, it doesn't take much to say, what are the odds of 3 female lineages? And that's exactly what the Bible says. Pretty low. The Bible is reality. We see that over and over and over again. Those 3 female lineages you can see here, there's the L genetic haplogroup, there's the M, and there's the N. In addition to that, these 3 lineages, L, M, and N, are seen dispersing from this location in Africa. And if I put a little circle in that area that encompasses all 3, even though today people like to talk about the Out of Africa event, and that's where humanity came from, this is all within, I guess you could say, this is all within the margin of error right here in this circle. And of course, this circle includes the Middle East, which is where the Tower of Babel would have been. So then the question kind of becomes, why is it that people keep saying that humanity came out of Africa, when in reality we know that the Tower of Babel was up here somewhere? But before we look at that, just again, look at this. If the Bible was just a bunch of fairy tales, you'd expect the Tower of Babel to be like here, or here, or here, or anywhere else in the world, apart from where everybody would assume that this all happened from when you look at the data. But when you look at the data, it points exactly in the direction of what happened in the Bible. So, why is it then that people like to say that everything came out of Africa here? Well, the timeline is based on genetic diversity, and the more diversity there is, the more mutations you see in a people group, that generally means an older culture, because the older culture will have accumulated those mutations over that longer period of time. So there's a little bit more diversity in Northeast African cultures than others. But the Middle Eastern culture is not far behind that. This is not a huge gap. So what could cause this discrepancy? Higher mutation rates in African cultures due to isolated populations. So if you have a population of people that are isolated for a while, mutations will accumulate faster in those populations than people groups that spread out a little bit more. In addition to that, different demographics can affect this as well. If you have higher birth and or death rates, that will affect it too. So like I mentioned, this map, anywhere in here is like within the margin of error. We see pretty much the same number of mutations in this general area. Larger number of mutations mean older culture, so we can assume that the dispersion occurred somewhere here. And of course, we know specifically from the Bible that it occurred somewhere in the Middle East here. But that's exactly what we see when we just use logic along with the data that's present from our analysis and from our studies. Any questions up to this point? Isn't this fun? It's not like you have to dig super deep to find science that supports Scripture. It's all right there on the surface, if only we open our eyes to it.